Hello everyone, it's WWDC week. Yesterday we had the keynote and then a few hours later the platform State of the Union, which is essentially a second keynote but this time aimed specifically at us iOS developers with more technical content. And like with every year, I want to share with you what are my highlights from this platform State of the Union video. So let's get started immediately. And of course, to begin, I want to talk about the new UI redesign of iOS 26. I still need to wrap my brain around the fact that now we are not counting in incremental like versions, but we're using the number of the year. So Xcode 26, iOS 26, macOS 26, everything is now numbered 26 this year. And as I'm sure you've already seen, the main feature of iOS 26 is this new UI redesign, which is not as strong as when you think back about it, the redesign between iOS 6 and iOS 7. This one was a clear break from like the reality-inspired design to something that was much more flat, much more abstract. Here, I would say we are more in the continuity of what we currently had, but with a new, I don't know how to describe it, like main paradigm, main metaphor, which is that of liquid. So it's called liquid glass. If you saw what the Vision Pro looked like, if you've tried the Vision Pro, it definitely rings a bell because when you think about it, it's essentially the UI of the Vision Pro, but ported on iOS, except that iOS keeps its app icons, which are squares with rounded corners. There were rumors about the app icons becoming circles, just like on the Vision Pro. That did not happen. But for the rest of the UI, as you can see, it's heavily inspired by the Vision Pro. There is the idea of putting the content first and foremost. That was already something that was in motion. You can remember that a few years ago, the status bar was removed, or rather not removed, it's still there, but it used to be that the status bar was taking a space with no content behind it on the screen. For a few years, we've had content behind the status bar, and now the idea is to put content behind all of the UI. This makes me think that maybe in September, we'll have a new iPhone which maybe no border at all, because it feels, I mean, when you look at the UI, the small black bezel, they feel even more out of place with this new UI. So maybe there will be some hardware announcement waiting in September. And in the meantime, what's interesting for us iOS developers is how can we test that our app work correctly with this new UI design. So the easiest way to do it is to just download Xcode 26 and recompile your app using the SDK of iOS 26. And you will see the new design appear. Typically, one of the places where you might notice the new design first is if you have a tab view. Well, now your tab view is going to have this new design where indeed, as you can see, the content is still visible, or rather becomes visible under the tab view. So maybe it will work nicely with your design. Maybe you will need to fix it. I saw also people that were complaining that here you can see that home is pretty readable, but it seems that depending on the icon, depending on the color, depending on the content that there is behind, the readability isn't always ideal. I would expect Apple to fix that by the time of the final release, but it's also something to keep in mind when you're going to adapt your app. You want your app to stay readable, of course. But one thing that's worth noting is that not all of the UI features of the new paradigm will be enabled by default. For example, here, if you take a look at the view on the left, so the view where you have the landmarks, map, and collections button, you can see that it doesn't show the content that's under it, but you can show it by explicitly enabling it. So for this, you add a modifier called here background extension effects. And you can see that when you use this modifier, then you see the content behind it. And this look and feel seems more aligned with what is, we could say, like the spirit of this new UI paradigm. I guess the reason why it's not enabled by default is that it might cause readability issues, or maybe it doesn't look pretty unless you pay special attention for it. But all that to say, just recompiling your app with the new SDK isn't enough to make the most of what this new Liquid Glass can offer. You will need to also look more into details and, if you want to, enable some options on a case-by-case basis. I'm gonna stop there for the new UI. There is a lot more that I could say, but it would take way too much time and I want to speak about other topics. But if you have any questions or remarks on that new UI, let me know in the comments. I would love to do maybe more dedicated video on this topic over the summer. So please let me know. And let's move on to the next highlight, which is the icon composer. So now we have an app to create our app icons because a PNG, a flat file, is not enough. Now we need to have layers, and this way the system, iOS, can understand how our app icon is structured in layers and can apply effects. So I'm guessing an effect that could be applied using this layered construction would be a parallax effect. You might have already seen it because it's been there for quite some time on the Apple TV. If you go on the TV, so the TV Plus app on the Apple TV, and you go over the thumbnail of a piece of content and then you move the trackpad slightly, not enough to switch to the next content, but just to make the thumbnail move a bit, you will see that the title is not moving exactly at the same speed, we could say, than the background, and it gives a very nice depth effect that's been there for quite some time. So it will be nice to see if app icons also have this feature, because I've always liked this effect. I'm not sure I would like it, to be honest, if all of my app icons were to do it all the time, but when you see it once, it's pretty cool. And one of the other advantages of this layered way of building app icons is that it makes it easier to adapt to things like dark mode, but also to a more transparent mode. So if Apple made the effort of creating a dedicated app, it's probably because they have the idea that they might even be using these new layered app icons for even more things in the future. So I think it's definitely worth the effort adapting your icon to this new look and feel, especially when you consider the fact that your app icon is literally what people see the first about your app, even on the App Store. And so, well, you don't want your app icon to look old because that just gives a bad image to your app. And this makes me think that I'm also curious to see if the App Store app is going to be able to take advantage of this layered construction of the app icon. I haven't been able to check it out yet. I haven't installed iOS 26 yet, but if you've seen in iOS 26 some cool usage of this layered way of building app icons, same thing, please let me know in the comments. And now we are moving on to one of the most exciting features for developers of iOS 26, which is the fact that we can now use a foundation model, so a model like ChatGPT or Claude, which is hosted directly on the device. So it's running locally. You don't need internet to run the model. And it's super easy to interact with this model. As you can see, to run a query, so just like basically sending a message to ChatGPT, you only need 3 lines of code, 1 line to import the framework called Foundation Models. So it's interesting to see that it bears the same name than the Foundation package, which has absolutely nothing to do with AI. So a great way to confuse people that will be getting started into iOS, unfortunately. Then you create what's called a language model session. I guess it's the equivalent of opening a chat window with ChatGPT on your browser. And then you make a call to the model. So you use the method respond on the session and you give it your prompt as an argument. You have to mark it as await because even though it's not running over the network, it still takes some time to run and you probably don't want to block the UI of your app while the model is reasoning. And you also need to mark it as trying because it can fail. Actually, when I tried the feature yesterday, I got some failures. So you will probably want to test that it works correctly and that you have a fallback for when it doesn't work. In a way, it's the same thing than with network calls when you think about it. And we're going to see that this similarity between calling an API, so using the network and using an on-device AI model, doesn't stop in the similarity of this way of making a call to the model, because there is also a new, not a new framework, but a new annotation called generable. And as we're going to see, it's extremely similar to codable, because let's imagine that we have this code. As you can see, the data model looks very similar to what you could be retrieving from an API. So you could definitely expect these struct and enum to be marked as codable or just decodable. But now you can also mark them as generable. And as you can see on the last line, it means that you will be able to pass a generable type to the language model session, and the language model session will be able to return to you an instance. So it's basically going to act as an AI-powered initializer for a type. This is pretty powerful. You can see that there is definitely the will for Apple to make these AI features, these on-device AI features, as easy to use as possible for developers, but also as familiar as possible to use, because they reuse a lot of what we are used to with Codable, so that if you already know about Codable, trying this new generable should be quite easy. And it doesn't stop there, because you can also give a way for the large language model running locally to interact with your code. So to allow the LLM to call some functions in your code, this is done by wrapping these functions around a protocol. So that's called a tool, where you give a name, a description, and the way to call the code. If you've ever tried to enable ChatGPT to call functions, this looks very, very, very similar. And when you put it all together, you can do some pretty interesting things, like, for example, making your model able to get data about the weather, but it could be anything that's related to the specific business of your app. And here you can see an example where everything is put together. You can even see some more advanced annotation with the @guide annotation, which is kind of like a small prompt that gives context to the model as to what the property actually does. I guess it's especially useful when the name of the property isn't self-describing, like here, rational. What does it mean? I guess it's a good thing to give more context to the model. And you can see how, using this pretty simple code, this app is able to add an AI-powered feature that's going to be suggesting, I think it's hike trails in this case. So it's pretty exciting, honestly, because it makes it super easy to try AI in your app. To be honest, it might even be a bit too easy, in the sense that I'm sure we can expect a lot of apps to give this feature a try, because the effort will be minimum. So we might see some AI features that might not be like super useful or not enough like thought through. But in a way, it's always a good thing, because then all of the bad features will go away and we will only keep the best ones. So brace yourself if you use a lot of iOS apps, because you might see AI features become the new trend by the end of the year. But if you're an iOS engineer, this is really exciting, because it means that you can start building some pretty advanced like AI capabilities into your app quite easily. And since everything is running locally, it seems that you don't have to worry about API key. My understanding is that running the model is free, because no network call is being made and you're not using external compute. You're only using the compute of the user's device. So I guess the only thing to be mindful of would be battery life, because I'm not sure how the battery is going to hold if you run an LLM like a lot of time on a device, especially like maybe on the iPhone, which has a smaller battery. But it's definitely super exciting to see this feature coming to iOS. And same thing, if you've already tried it yourself and you found some useful features, or if you were a bit disappointed, also, please let me know in the comments. Would love to know about it. Now let's move on to Xcode. So if, like me, you had been waiting for Swift Assist to be released by the end of last year as it was promised, well, now we do have a Swift Assist feature, even though they never reused that name again. Now we have a ChatGPT directly in Xcode with what looks like basically cursor built into Xcode. When you look at the UI, it seems extremely familiar to what cursor looks like, except that the chat the chat window is on the left, which personally I find way more natural than having it on the right, especially for people like me who are used reading left to right. You're used to have what drives the main content on the left rather than on the right. So I'm really looking forward to try this feature. I haven't been able to try it yet because you do need to install the beta of macOS 26 to try it. Xcode 26 alone is not enough, so I haven't been able to try it. But one thing I really like in what they've announced is first the fact that it's not just about text, it's multimodal, so you can also give it an image. And here you can see we have an image which is a drawing made on the new, I forgot the name of it's Freeform. Yeah, on the Freeform app, you can see it with like the dotted white background. So you give this rough mockup to the AI and it implements a basic version of the UI in SwiftUI. So pretty impressive. I'm looking forward to trying it with my own examples. And another thing I really like is the fact that just like we have the writing tools available in basically any text view on iOS, any text view, any text field, now we have the coding tools which offer the same type of features but focused on code. So first you have two buttons, one to generate a playground, one to generate a preview from the local code. And it's gonna generate either a preview or a playground. Playgrounds like this are new, by the way, and it's just like a preview, but for non-UI code. I tried it, it works pretty well, and it's a pretty nice addition, especially when you're able to generate the playground on the go just by asking the AI to do it. And what you can see here is that the big added value is that the AI also generates the mocked data in order to be able to use the code in the playground. So that's really useful. It feels like a very useful prototyping or debugging feature, and I'm really looking forward to giving it a try. Another features of the coding tool is to be able to generate documentation for your code. So here it's kind of interesting. As an experienced developer, I would be very cautious about not abusing it in the sense that no documentation will always be better than bad or misleading documentation. So unless you're absolutely sure that what generated is correct, you might want to think twice about using this feature. Like typically, I wouldn't recommend doing this, generating documentation for every function, because you might end up with documentation that maybe you will never even read, and it might become incorrect because you will not update it correctly. So it looks pretty cool, but really when I see that, the first thing I think is I don't think I will be disciplined enough to like rigorously review what's being generated. And so maybe I want to be a bit more cautious about it, to be honest. But still, it could be really interesting in some use cases. My message is just, I wouldn't recommend that you try to use it for every single function in your code. Don't use this to aim for 100% comment coverage or something like this. I think it could be like a recipe for disaster. I'm also looking forward to test it and to see if it gives actually like good documentation, especially when you get into like some very tricky behavior. I'm thinking typically things about rendering where everything is a pixel and you can't rely on a type system as much as in other type of code to understand what the code does. I'm really curious to see what these automated comments will look like. And there are also a few other additions for generative AI in Xcode which I wanted to show you. This one, which allows you to fix an issue, but using AI. So just like the fix me that we had before, but that we're relying on static rules, this time you can use the AI for this. Honestly, if the AI is good, it could work well because I've used this feature with Cursor quite a few times and it worked quite well, but it really depends on whether the AI understands your code. So typically, if the fix me tries to generate like SwiftUI code, but that's not supported by your current minimum iOS version, it might be an issue. So same thing, I'm really curious to giving it a try, but the fact that it's available straight in Xcode, you don't have to go through a third-party software, makes it, or not makes it valuable, but gives it the potential to be very valuable. And one more example is for localized string. You can now generate the comment that will be used by the translator to gain more context about what a localized string represents. So you can generate that using AI. So could be super useful because honestly, generating these comments, writing them by hand rather as a developer is not the most enticing task. Very often it's quite repetitive. You don't add a lot of value. I think in most cases, AI could be quite good at doing it. So definitely you want to give it a try, but don't trust it blindly. Give it a try first, because depending on what your app does, maybe it might struggle. Maybe some apps have very specific business domains. So you definitely want to give it a try. But I see here potential for automating a task that is really not fun for developers. And to finish on the topic of AI features in Xcode, one thing I really like is that there is a lot of choice on which model you want to use to power all of these features. So by default, it's going to use ChatGPT with some free queries, and then you can make more queries if you link your ChatGPT account. But you can also use other models. For example, here you have the cloud models, and you need to get your API key for these models, and of course to pay for credits, for tokens. But the fact that you can switch models and use the one that you prefer is pretty cool, especially for people that might have been using software like Cursor or Alex Sidebar, and maybe they have like their routine of how they work with a specific model. Well, you can keep this model into Xcode, so it's pretty cool. And also, as model tend to evolve much faster than Xcode, which is still on a 1-year release cycle, it means that we will be able, probably, or most certainly, given what I'm going to show just after, we will be able to use more recent models as they get released during the year. And that's pretty exciting, because one thing that I was very worried about was Xcode delivering some features, some AI features. They're kind of nice at the time of release, but then as the year goes by, they get outmatched by the other AI models, which are evolving rapidly and definitely faster than a 1-year release cycle. So it's really cool to see that Apple was able to address this issue. And the last thing which makes me think that you should not be blocked integrating newer models is the fact that you can even integrate models which are running locally. So if you are very concerned about privacy, or if your organization is very concerned about privacy, you can use the AI features in Xcode with local models. So maybe there will be some caveats. Maybe some of the features I've showed you before won't work as well or won't work with local models. I'm not sure, to be honest. But the fact that you can do that is really cool, especially for some organizations where privacy is really important. It makes me think also that it might be a feature that Apple built for themselves, because maybe they don't want to send the code of the new iOS version that they are working on to ChatGPT servers, for example. So pretty cool. Honestly, this one, I wasn't expecting Xcode to offer such an integration with third-party model. I was positively surprised about it. Of course, you could also understand it as like Apple, in a way, like admitting that they are not the driving force in AI, and so they need to make room for the actual driving forces in their ecosystem. So you can understand it however you want, but I'm really glad to see that we have this level of flexibility. All right, that's enough for Xcode. Now let's move on to Swift, because there were some really interesting announcements. Of course, the announcements of Swift, we got a glimpse of them before the WWDC, because Swift evolution process happens much more in the open than the evolution process of iOS. But you will see that if you were struggling updating your code for Swift 6, there are definitely some good news. So first, I wanted to share a couple features that were announced. They are more about like type safety, or rather code safety and performance. So you might not use these features a lot, because when you write app level code, you will be less likely to use them, but they put a strong emphasis on them, so I still want to mention them. So first one is an inline array, which is basically the possibility to allocate an array of fixed size on the stack. So something that you can do in programming languages like C, for example. Well, now you can also do it in Swift, but in a way that is much more safe, because you also benefit from all of the safety features of Swift. So for app developers, I'm not sure it will be used a lot, but if you write some performance intensive code where allocating arrays was a big bottleneck, well, now you have a way to solve that with a built-in feature of Swift. And another feature which was also introduced is called span, which you can basically see as safe pointers. So same thing, as an app developer, I'm not sure you will use it a lot, but if you ever need to write code that interfaces with other programming languages like C or C++, this seems to be a very powerful feature. So it's this kind of features where for most developers, I think it won't make a big difference, but for the developers that do need it, it can make a world of difference. And now moving on to an announcement that I'm sure will have an impact on many more iOS developers. This should have an impact on virtually any app developer out there. So if you ever try to enable your project for Swift 6 mode, which checks which has like static checks to prevent data races, I'm sure you had to deal with a lot of errors, with a lot of warnings. And that's basically because when you run your code, when you build your code in Swift 6 mode, basically, Swift assumes that anything could run concurrently. I'm simplifying a bit, but that's the gist of it. It assumes that everything could run concurrently, and so it's extremely strict on the warnings and the errors that it emits. And so you have to do a lot of extra work to make everything super safe to run concurrently, even though most of your program might not be running concurrently. Think typically when you write an iOS app, most of the code or a good part of the code runs on the main thread because it's all of the UI bound code. And this code, it runs on the main thread. It cannot run anywhere else. Otherwise your app crashes. And so it doesn't make sense for such code to be as aggressively checked for data races because data races just can't happen or are way less likely to happen. There is way less room for them to happen because everything is running on the same thread. So you can have concurrent code in the sense that a function can pause execution, but you can't have parallel code because there is only one thread running. So you can't have two threads running code at the same time. And so now in Swift, you have a way to say that by default, your code should run on the main actor unless you specify so. And when you do it, all of the warnings that are here on screen disappear. So as you can see, you can still use asynchronous code. You can still use async await because you can still pause some code and then your main thread will resume it later. So you can still use concurrency, but you can't run code in parallel unless you explicitly specify it, and you specify it with a new attribute, which is called addConcurrent, and this attribute will allow you to break from the main actor. So think typically if you want to make a network call, well, the code that implements the network call will probably be using addConcurrent under the hood. If you want to decode a very large JSON file also, it could make total sense to use addConcurrent, and only the code that is marked addConcurrent will be executed outside of the main thread. And so only that code will have to be checked more aggressively for data races. One thing I want to highlight here is that this is quite a complex topic. I still need to dive deeper into it, to dive deeper into how the addConcurrent attribute works. So it's possible that in what I said, I made some approximations. Maybe I used the word concurrent and parallel, maybe in not the perfect way. So please don't take what I said before as being technically 100% accurate. My goal was more to give you a high-level view of the changes, and then I'm sure I'll make some more dedicated videos to this topic over the summer. And to finish, let's talk about the new addition to SwiftUI that I found really cool. So first, now if you want to display an in-app browser, it has become much easier. You don't need to create an actual browser controller, display it on the navigation stack manually. You just need to call a special version of the open URL closure, which you can get through the environment, and it will automatically open the URL inside an in-app browser rather than by default opening the URL in Safari. But this is not the only web-related new feature in SwiftUI, because SwiftUI has finally gained a built-in web view. It's hard to believe that there was no built-in web view in SwiftUI after 5 years of SwiftUI, but the sixth year was the one where we finally got a built-in web view. So it's just called WebView. And this means that if you've already created your own web view by encapsulating WK WebView, you might have some naming conflicts. But this will probably be quite a useful API because, as we all know, even though we might not like web views that much, we always end up having to use them one way or another. There is always one page where it doesn't make sense to build dedicated UI, so we just go for a web view instead. So this is probably one of the most used like components, whether we like it or not. And it's nice to see it's finally getting a SwiftUI API. And what's interesting is that along with the web view, we also have a web page API, which will allow us to programmatically control the content of the web view. So I'm looking forward to diving a bit deeper into this API because we could control programmatically the content of the web view using WK WebView, but it could be quite cumbersome. Sometimes you had to implement like complex delegate methods, do all of this kind of code that takes a lot of boilerplate. So I'm really curious to see what features the web page API will actually offer. I hope they won't trade like simplicity for a lack of feature, but I'm really looking forward to what's going to be available. And finally, the last feature I wanted to show you is that in SwiftUI, the text editor view is now compatible with attributed strings. And so you can create a rich text editor in your app. This could be quite interesting and powerful for apps that focus a lot on the user entering text. So think about all of the notes app, all of the journaling app, I guess a good part of the productivity app. You can do some very interesting things. Here you can see in this example that this app is able to build some kind of visual language just by being able to use the green color inside the text. So a lot of exciting possibilities if you have the kind of app that already uses a text editor, of course. And that's it. These were the features announced at WWDC 2025 that I really wanted to share with you. These were my personal highlights. Of course, this is definitely not an exhaustive list of all of the features. I definitely recommend that you do watch the platform State of the Union video. It doesn't last super long, it's just a bit under 1 hour if I recall correctly. I've put the link in the description. I really recommend that you check it out and that you also check out the WWDC sessions that are relevant for what you are using in your app. And of course, if there's any new API or feature that I haven't covered but that you think iOS developers should be aware of, please let me know in the comments. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like. Don't forget also to subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss my next videos. I will probably create new videos about the new announcements from WWDC later this month and during the summer. Thank you for watching and see you next time.